Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Royal Scottish Academy. My name's Colin Greenslade. I am the director of the Royal Scottish Academy, and it's my job to introduce everybody tonight. It's nice to see lots of faces, and I hope you've all enjoyed our exhibition upstairs of Elizabeth and John's A Journey Shared. So tonight we're going to listen to some discussions and presentations from Alexander Moffat RSA, George Donald RSA, Professor Duncan Macmillan HRSA, and Lucinda Middleton, who's our acquisitions coordinator at the Royal Scottish Academy Collections. The Voyages of the Eye Symposium is an expansion of the celebration of the lives of John Houston and Dame Elizabeth Blackadder, as seen in the galleries upstairs and expanded tonight for your delectation through our speakers. In 2021, Elizabeth gifted her estate to the Royal Scottish Academy. This encompassed objects, paintings, prints, drawings from her own career and that of her husband, John Houston. It was accompanied by a monetary gift in excess of $7 million, and this has already begun to fund initiatives for the Academy to support artists from across their careers. This holistic enablement of artists funding other artists to travel, experience, create and present new practice is not a new initiative for us, and indeed funds from our Gillis bequest of 50 years ago and the John Kinross bequest of some 40 plus years ago continue to make significant impact on artists and architects in Scotland today. The Academy disperses some 300,000 to artists in prizes, awards, residencies and travel grants annually. We do this from our own restricted funds and investments, and the addition of invested funds from the Blackadder Houston bequest significantly enhances opportunities for artists across Scotland. To further enhance this, the proceeds from the sale of bringing a selection of studio works to market by both John and Elizabeth will continue to increase the investment and enable further opportunities. As lecturers, colleagues, friends and academicians, both John and Elizabeth had a lifetime of steering and supporting other artists, and they continue to do this with this incredible legacy. This evening we'll hear about aspects of their careers and enjoy the benefit of other voices assisting to assert John and Elizabeth's importance of the legacy of them in the history of Scottish art. There will be some time for questions at the close of the event, so do listen hard. And as we've got a lot to talk about in a short time, I'm going to introduce and hand over to Alexander Moffat to start us off.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you all for coming tonight. I'm going back to the beginning. 1963, the Art College Revel. Myself, John Bellany, with our tutor, John Houston. I think that John Bellany would probably win the fancy dress prize. So I'm going to stay in 1963. Easter Scholarship, a very small amount of money which both John Bellany and I were awarded. And normally you would go to London. It was enough to take you to London. We went to see John and we said, we're going to go to Paris. He said, well, that's ambitious, but I'm going to be in Paris at Easter time with my wife, and we'll all meet up. So we did. We all met up in the Jeu de Paume, which was the Impressionist gallery in those days. And then we were taken for lunch, and we were taken to the art students' bar, La Palette, and we had a very good day indeed. And it's one of those days that remain with you all through my life. And when John Bellany was alive, we always reminisced about that particular day in Paris. It was crucial to our lives as artists. And I think what Colin was saying earlier, it typified in a way John and Elizabeth in their support for young artists, for all sorts of artists. And that's something that continued, as it were, throughout their lives. You could see in the 1950s they were founder members of the 57 Gallery, And then later on, I mean, their support for the classical printmaking studio was really quite immense. So I think I'll move from 1963 to maybe the late 40s. The beginnings of the Edinburgh Festival, for example, in 1947, was a time of great idealism. I mean, it was a time of great austerity as well, but great idealism. I mean, the whole point of the festival, signifying a new beginning after several years of slaughter and barbarity. A healing process, in fact, that only art, music, theatre could deliver. And that was vitally important. This was the era that John and Elizabeth became students and grew up in. And I think they obviously inherited, this kind of idealism. You know, I was speaking to some students during the festival, young students, young people, and not one of them knew a festival was going on. All they could speak about was a fringe. They had no idea about the festival. They had no idea why the festival had begun or why it was founded. And that worries me. That does deeply worry me. I mean, they were supposedly educated. But you know, unless you're educated in cultural matters, you're not educated at all. Absolutely not. I think when we go back to the Edinburgh College of Art in the 1940s, I mean, the great figure was William Gillis, who'd become head of painting at the end of the Second World War. Now, what Gillis brought to Edinburgh, to the Art College, was quite a lot. He's a key figure. But I'm not going to get into Gillis too much today, because in a few months' time, the RSA will be presenting a Gillis exhibition commemorating, as it were, the 50th anniversary of his death. But Gillis had studied in Paris in the 1920s. He'd studied in the studio of André Ozonfong, a Cubist studio. And the other thing that had deeply affected Gillis was an exhibition of the Norwegian Edvard Munch, a lone exhibition that the SSA, the Society of Scottish Artists, had brought to Edinburgh in 1931. Now, the Scotsman was inundated with letters protesting about this appalling exhibition, and basically the argument was, our young artists must be protected from this evil continental European influence. But it didn't protect Gillis. Gillis was completely bowled over by Munch. So Gillis offered two things then: an introduction to French modernism and also an introduction to Northern European modernism. So these two things he brought to Edinburgh College of Art. And of course, in many ways, these are, to really simplify matters, we could say that John Huston was definitely attracted to Northern European Expressionism, whereas Elizabeth, very much to French modernism. But I'm simplifying. I'm just making it easy at the moment. Yeah. So I'm going to try and work this again. So this is a Gillis landscape from 32. It's a searing, it's a dark, emotional picture. Undoubtedly, this is coming from Munch. And in 1952, this is a classic Gillis of the period, a rigorously intellectual still life. And these are the kind of things that Gillis' students would inherit. Very, very important. Now, there's a very interesting quote about Gillis by Elizabeth, where she says something like, "We were all treated equally, both men and women." So that kind of suggests there maybe was a kind of not taking women too seriously at that stage. But Gillis did, which was vitally important to Elizabeth. I can tell you another little story that John Huston told me. At the end of the second year, where we were all completing a general course before deciding whether or not to go or to be accepted into the painting school or the design school, William McTaggart would stand behind a female student and say in a very loud voice, "You'll be going into design then." So that was the way it was done. But at the same time, I mean, in the early 60s, when I was a student, we have to remember that both, let's say, Joan Eardley and Anne Redpath were widely recognised as the greatest painters in Scotland. So there was that kind of balance. Let's see if we can move this forward. Now, the other great teaching figure alongside Gillis was John Maxwell. And Maxwell, too, had studied in Paris, in the studio of Fernand Léger. So both of these guys, Gillis and Maxwell, had a lot to bring to their students in this particular period of the late 40s, early 50s. Tragically, Maxwell was to die in 1961, and so my generation, as it were, we missed out on him. But again, you can see that he was more of a Chagall man, a poet. And let's just move this. I just want to quickly look at Peploe, who was one of the great precursors, as it were, of the Edinburgh School that kind of came to prominence after the Second World War. I think Peploe became ill in the 30s, and Gillis actually took his job in the Art College. But Peploe and J.D. Ferguson had been hanging around in France since the very end of the 19th century, and they brought back lots of dynamic, as it were, new ideas about painting to Edinburgh, to Scotland. Ferguson always said that modernism, in a sense, was a back to basics. We're going back to basics. And you can see that in this Peploe painting, which is just looking at it, it looks very simple, but it's certainly dynamic. It certainly makes its point. And, there's the legacy, Peploe, Ferguson, Gillis, the Edinburgh School, post-war, was really where modernism, in a sense, happened in painting in Scotland. I mean, when we look elsewhere, we look at Glasgow, we look at Aberdeen, we look at Dundee, we don't see this happening there. And we had Mackintosh at the very beginning of the 20th century, but it was all over by the First World War, completely extinguished. So I think when we look right now at the modernism of the Edinburgh School, we can really say it wasn't happening anywhere else in Scotland. So well worth reassessing. I'd like to say a little bit about John and Elizabeth as teachers. I mean, the main reason for going to art school in 1960 was that the school you were choosing would have a formidable staff that you wanted to study with. You weren't going to art school to get some degree or anything like that. You wanted to study with people like John Huston, like people like Gillis, etc. That was the whole point. And it proved, in fact, very, very beneficial. I have to say I was never taught by Elizabeth. She wasn't teaching at Edinburgh College of Art at that time. I double-checked, just in case my memory was was failing me. Sure enough, she wasn't teaching in 63, she wasn't teaching in 64, but in 1965, a Mrs. Elizabeth Houston joins the staff. Change days, eh? Yep, so there we go. I mean, I've spoken to a number of artists who actually did study with Elizabeth, and they've spoken extremely highly of her, of what she had to say, what she had to impart, as it were. I think with you're studying with a good painter, with a John Huston, so you've got lots of questions that he answers, because he's a practical painter. He's not some guy that's just read a book about painting. He actually does it. And that's the most important thing of all. So drawing, colour, composition, all these things we discussed. He could be critical as well. He could be quite tough. He didn't beat about the bush if you were messing around. I remember years later, actually, probably in the 80s, we were touring a degree show, John and I, and we came across a couple of students who'd been awarded first-class honours. And John didn't waste any time. He reminded them what they still needed to do. They'd maybe completed a first-class honours at Edinburgh College of Art, but there was still a hell of a lot to do. And he told them. There and then, yeah. So, at the end of the day, what did he leave with me, as it were? What did I take with me, as it were, for the next 60 years as a working artist? Well, all I can say is a hell of a lot. But I think the main thing was, in a sense, one has, if you're going to be a painter, you have to take the long view. It's not something that just happens overnight. There are no easy routes to becoming a good painter, as it were. So that has been something that I've always taken from John. Now, I think recently, only a few weeks ago, I think during the festival, Elizabeth was compared to Matisse in one of the newspaper reviews. And hey, nothing wrong with that. I think she knew about Matisse. It's important to know about Matisse if you're going to be a painter. I think it's about where things go in a painting. It's about the placing of whatever it is, a sculpture, a carpet, a drapery, a sculpture, a painting. And that's what I think Elizabeth learned from Matisse. But of course, again, you've got to have the courage to put it into practice. You've got to have the courage to improvise. And she certainly had that. There's a great Matisse painting which he did in his 60s of a reclining nude. And this painting took several months. And there are a series of photographs of the painting in 20, 30 different stages. So he had a great problem. I mean, looking at any of the stages, I would have been quite happy with them. But this is where courage comes in. And as Matisse also said, when you're making a painting, when you're working on a painting, you have to let the painting teach you. It's not a foregone conclusion. It's not a system you're following. And I think that's the great thing about Elizabeth's work, that it always has this incredible quality of freshness, of just moving these objects around to create different patterns and different images. And that's what gives it, ultimately, its great strength. And moving to Emile Nold, who lived on the other side of the North Sea, the other side of the North Sea from Fife, I should say, from Buckhaven, we can see that Nold and John were in a kind of dialogue at times. I think a good dialogue. I mean, Nold was a very strange man. He was banned from painting once when the Nazis came to power in 1933. But he was worse than the Nazis. He was like a primitive racist. He felt the Nazis weren't going strong enough. But he did some great paintings. But we have to face the fact that he was a very strange human being. So, in summing up my little bit, as Colin said, John and Elizabeth have left a formidable legacy to the Royal Scottish Academy, which will be used in many, many ways, helping artists, producing publications, doing all sorts of things. Of course, John was also, a great champion of Scottish art, of what should be happening here. And this is the way, I think, that both of them are ensuring that will happen. But they were possibly the last eminent artists who studied at Edinburgh College of Art under William Gillis. Drawing and painting were taken seriously. As a result, they were able to acquire painterly skills, practical knowledge, which are largely unattainable today. And I think that's worth pondering. Maybe the last of the great painters. That makes their legacy and their work as artists all the more important. And I think the task that now lies ahead for us, the Royal Scottish Academy as it were, is to maintain the values and beliefs that John and Elizabeth adhere to. It's a huge challenge, but a vital one. Thank you very much.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's lovely to see you all. I can offer you 5 little cameos, shall we call them, or miniatures is perhaps more appropriate for today's topic, of my interaction with John and Elizabeth. I was taught by Elizabeth very briefly, and so I'm following on from what Sandy's just told us. So really, John and Elizabeth were very part of the fabric of my youth and my student days. Firstly, John was a tutor along with Phillipson and Hunter and Cummings and Peploe, Fees, of course. And I recall still life painting classes with John. He would stand there jingling his change in his pockets, but throwing out little nuggets of wisdom. He was a man who enjoyed, and I did too, and that's why I liked him very much, colour and that French connection that Sandy just told us about, the matière, that idea that paint itself has a message. Paint itself is an element. It's not just something to create the image, but it's part of the image, and it is invested with emotion. And I got that was very much part of that belle peinture, which was the hallmark of Scottish painting, which Sandy has very kindly, historically, discussed with us. And I remember stair-heed conversations with Elizabeth, very shy manner, her hesitant voice, and the smile playing over her face. Those of you who knew her will know what I'm talking about. A twinkle in her lovely dark eyes, and her enthusiasm for the sheer love of visual beauty. I was a colonial kid, and something of the imagery of my childhood in India found its way into my work, and I especially recall conversations with Elizabeth, particularly about India, about fabrics. Oh, I should be pressing buttons here. Sorry about that. Nothing's happening. No, I'm going backwards. Sorry. I should be doing this. No. Well, this will do. Yes, there's John Houston. This is a screen print, but you know the matière is there as well. This is a print which I'll explain later. I was a technical assistant in making it. Here's some more of the stuff I'm talking about, where gesture and colour come together. And here I am talking about the things I discussed with Elizabeth when I was a young student. And that links me to cameo number 2, which is after a postgraduate year, I was awarded a travelling scholarship, and I chose to drive in a second-hand Mini to India. You could do that in those days. And on my return to London, I was accepted into Hornsey College of Art, which, well, it's subsumed into Middlesex University now, like other art colleges that used to be independent, that are now parts of universities that I could mention. And at that time, it was an icon of student revolt. It was 1968, folks. If you remember it, you remember it. Kent State, the Paris student protests, and in Hornsey College of Art, we had our own sit-ins. And it turned out to be, for me anyway, a wonderful educational process. Luminaries like Maurice de Sauzemarais, Tom Nairn, some of you will know him, Peter Green was my particular professor, had a profound influence upon me at that time. And students that were there, Paul Niago and Ken Kiff and Anish Kapoor, you'll know these names. Our protests and our sit-ins were supported by Kitai and Hockney. They would come round and encourage us to sit in. And so it became, formally and informally, a fabulous education. The point about this is that there I was in London, and I'd just done this traveller, and Robin Phillipson and John Houston would come down to, meetings in London, and they would take me out to posh places to eat. We starving students, as Sandy just said, we quite like that. And they would be very, very interested in my Indian adventures and stories. And I had a report to write, and I had paintings to paint. So it was very, very good to have them as my mentors, and their encouragement was terrific. Cameo 3 is later. I was a young lecturer then at Edinburgh College of Art, and John and Elizabeth were my colleagues. And I find myself very fortunate to be in a position to straddle what I thought was two kind of strands of Edinburgh College of Art. There was Inverleith, some of you here might know what I'm talking about. It was the postgraduate school, and it was also where printmaking was housed. And there was a garden with roses and a common room where we all had meals. And you could be a faculty member, you could be a student, you could be postgraduate, you could be first year or fourth year, all mucked in together. And nobody is superior at the printing press. Everybody, some people, first year students could give postgraduates advice there. It was a lovely leveler, I always thought. And so I remember, and I'll go back to that, oh, maybe I won't, but you saw that, one of those prints. A dear colleague of mine, Roy Wood, now no longer with us, who was my senior at the printmaking department, he and I acted as studio assistants for John over a long weekend where he was making one of those prints that you see there. I see it's down as a monoprint, but folks, it was actually a lithograph. And we prepared his plates for him. And I saw at first hand his attack, his approach, we would prepare his plates, he would put on the lithographic ink and washes. We would roll out various colours. He would say, no, like that, do this. In fact, I have a proof at home of a printer's proof, which I think is better than the one he did. But he chose the colours, and he was also extraordinarily jolly and generous. We would go for stonking meals, and my kids were always hanging around. They were young at the time. And he was so nice for them and asked their advice. And I just saw the measure of the man. He was very, very sweet, but lived his art. The weekend was, well, it gave me a taste for that kind of hard work and trying many different proofs to get to what you're trying to say. Printmaking is very good this way. It allows you to try a variety of essays before you come to if you ever do come to the one that you absolutely like. So that was a lovely little cameo of working with John. I see my next cameo is Japan, and when you look at the world map, you can see Scotland and Japan, if you've got that in your mind, on the fringes of a great landmass each, and both stretching out into the vast oceans that wash their shores. I fancy there's a sort of similarity somehow. And there's a long history of Scottish and Japanese cultural exchange. As far back as the 1870s, Japanese engineers came to learn shipbuilding at Clydeside. And in the 1890s, George Henry, RSA, you'll ken his work, and Edward Hornell spent a year and a half in Japan, mainly in Kyoto. And on their return, their Japonisme, which was being admired in France, was very much admired in Scotland at the same time. And you'll know, in Glasgow, you'll know their work particularly. On the side, I would say that Taketsuru, a gentleman from Japan in 1870, came to study distilling and married a Scotswoman, Jessie Cowan, and they returned to found the best malt distillery in Hokkaido. So they also, by the way, Gauguin left for Tahiti in about the same time. So there's a lot going on at that time. So encouraged by all this, and I dare say John and Elizabeth's travels that we could see in their work, that they subsequently produced, I packed a bag of my drawing stuff, and in the early 90s, I made off for the first of several visits I made to Japan. buying an all-Japan rail ticket, a fabulous thing in those days, and explored from Sapporo to Nagasaki in the south. I dare say I was inspired by Elizabeth's calm and beautifully poised Japanese still lives, and of course ukiyo-e, the woodcut prints of Japan, their calmness, their zen-like quality, and such a contrast to my own rather cluttered and feverish canvases. I doubt if my attempts to become like that have worked, but there you go. It was a wonderful and profound experience for me. And later, as we will see, John and Elizabeth's encouragement inspired my further adventures in Japan. So we're on to the fifth cameo, my fifth memory. Somewhere in the late 80s, David Mickey, RSA, blessed memory, collared me and suggested I find a group of colleagues to design and run a summer school at Edinburgh College of Art. After all, the college was a splendid place in a beautiful city, and all the departments with their facilities were empty during the summer months. And the festival and the fringe were on, so there were additional attractors. So the thought of working in summer months was less than exciting for some of my colleagues, but I found in Dr. Geraldine Prince, who was at that time teaching in the art history department, somebody who had an ambition for this, and together we began to design this, and I could organize studio and workshop courses. I had some experience of short course teaching in the Workers' Education Association. Do you remember that, some of you? And at universities in the USA. And she had a wonderful contextual cultural lectures that she provided, so that we had not just working in the studios, but as it were, contextual studies at the same time. And more importantly than that, she had a magical flair for parties and receptions, and this became the hallmark of our summer schools. With all this in our favour, the summer school was a great success from the start, and attendances snowballed each year. And I recall that Elizabeth took a lively interest in what we were doing. She loved the glossy, colourful brochures we produced, and she liked the fact that we were filling the college with a whole bunch of people from all over the world in the summer. It was very encouraging. And this active endorsement from John and Elizabeth gave our project the kind of credibility with our colleagues, which was very much appreciated, I can tell you. And then their generosity, I'm forgetting there we are, Japan, there we go. Their generosity in 1992, I remember the year, it was fantastic. They invited groups of summer school students to their lovely home in the Grange. It was an extraordinarily generous and wonderful thing to do. Here we go. And the house, their wonderful garden, which was Japanese in flavour, carp pond, the painting store, which was kind of built in the Japanese style, and of course the famous studios with the fans, the cats, the walls pinned with textiles, not to mention the canapes and wine. The whole experience offered to us and our students a wonderful experience, and must have impressed these students not only from the UK but from all over the world. It was quite extraordinary. And subsequently, I know that there were then very young lecturers that worked with us in the summer school, worked very hard. Elspeth Lamb, for example, and Paul Furneaux, both RSAs now. They I'm sure, were inspired because they have subsequently gone on to spend time in Japan and bring back their own Japanese-inspired art. The summer school expanded and became the Centre for Continuing Studies and successfully negotiated with the University Senate a part-time degree, which was quite an innovation at the time. And in due course, the CCS, as part of an expanding offer to students, organised study tours abroad to exotic locations, as exotic as I could make them, Iran, although our first trip was cancelled because of a little bit of difficulty in New York, but we went following years, Iran, India, and notably Japan. And I wonder is Robert Steedman here? Well, Robert and his dear wife were two who participated, I remember, in our trip to Japan. It was wonderful. And I dare say that the seeds of those innovative, adventurous, democratic and educational projects were sown in that lovely garden in the Grange. Let's see if I can find it. Well, I certainly know from my point of view that that influenced me and my work, following in their footsteps. I think these two major figures of the Scottish art scene, when I think of it, throwing open their home to us, serving nibbles and wine, magical environment rooted in Scottish painterly flair, and at the same time, a yearning for the exotic and the far away. That spirit of internationalism and support of students, that democratic ideal, it created visual art education at its finest. I think we are all very much indebted to. Can I go back? No, I can't. We're all very much indebted to John and to Elizabeth, and they were wonderful artists, and I am doubly indebted. Thank you, John. Thank you, Elizabeth. Generations to come give thanks to your ongoing generosity. Thank you.
See if I can command this button. The title of the show, which we're celebrating this symposium, is Voyages of the Eye, and John and Elizabeth travelled as much as they could, and but some of you could cast your mind back, as I could, to 60 years ago. Travel wasn't that easy. You couldn't just fly off anywhere. Cheap flights didn't start for another 30 years. When John bought a car in 1960, things opened up for them. But still, America was a long way away. And I think what I want to talk about is the relationship with America, the trip they made in 1969, but also through that to set them against a wider field than just Scottish art. They belong in a wider field. And I think their contact with American art obviously began before 1969, but was crucial in, I think, broadening their horizon. These are the Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Johnson of Johnson's Wax. And Mrs. Johnson had bought several pictures by John in the early 60s and invited him to America, to Racine, Wisconsin, and to their place on Lake Owen, which is nearby. There is the wax factory, Frank Lloyd Wright. They were very interested in art, and they collected, and they knew people who collected. So this was a terrific experience to go to this very rich environment, see people who had major pictures on their walls, but also, of course, to visit the great collections in New York and Washington. In the first talk, Sandy talked about Paris, and of course, Paris was a focus for modern art until the early 60s. There were a series of major exhibitions in London, probably backed by the CIA, of Jackson Pollock, Rothko, and Philip Guston, Rauschenberg, and Jasper Johns. And American art was becoming a matter of wide interest. As you can see, this is Frank Stella, bought by the Tate in 1965. And this is a picture by Elizabeth, 1969, which certainly seems to echo the Stella. But with that, I remember in the 60s, how the interest in American art gradually replaced the interest in contemporary art in Paris. American art was bigger, was bolder, and of course it was supported politically, I'd say. It was being promoted as an image of the soft power of America. Lake Owen, which is where they were based in America, painting by John on the left, painting by Clifford Still on the right. And I think you can see there, John is now looking at Clifford Still is a painter in whose work landscape is important, and the way that John has treated Lake Owen sky almost as an abstract scene does seem to echo this, the breadth of his American painting. But the artist who seems to echo through with both John and Elizabeth was Rothko. Here's Rothko here, and perhaps surprisingly, here's Elizabeth in 1970. The way she's divided up the canvas, the intensity of the colour, the details of still life are almost incidental to this very, very broad, formal arrangement, which I think echoes Rothko. And Rothko in 1969-70 was becoming increasingly austere. This is one of Rothko's paintings from 69. Just really, it's called grey and white, and it is just grey and white. And there again, look at Elizabeth, you see. She's taking it in, she's digesting it, and she's producing from that something which is entirely her own. But it's interesting to see they are quite cheerfully aligning themselves with these American painters. They're not saying, "How do you do, sir? I'm a minor little Scottish artist and I'm coming to admire what you're doing." They take it in, they're digesting it. But the artist who, perhaps surprisingly, seems to leave most trace with them is Mondrian. And Elizabeth talked about this and how they were impressed by seeing Mondrian. And this is Mondrian in typical grid painting from 1929. But notice it's in the Guggenheim, so it's one that they certainly, and they saw, it was particularly the Mondrians in the Guggenheim that they were struck by. This too, which is in MoMA, and not typical Mondrian in the early period, but this is how he was painting in the last years of his life. There's a story attached to this, actually. Robert Motherwell, American painter, told me how when Mondrian arrived in New York, he and other young painters with their wives were delegated to look after him. Mondrian liked to dance with the wives, and they sat and watched. But on one occasion, Motherwell said, they were sitting in a cafe by Central Park, and Mondrian said, "Excuse me, could we change places?" And well, of course, yes, and change places. But why? "I don't like looking at the trees," he said. So this is New York, Broadway boogie woogie. It's the dance, and it's the sort of the totally mechanical environment that he's celebrating as this big maybe of dance. But if you look at Elizabeth, again, 1970, this is a dancing picture, isn't it? And the white ground is precisely like the Mondrian white ground you see. It's a sort of, it's almost like wall paint. It's for flat white, and then she's got these wonderful shapes and colours literally dancing across it. In the Guggenheim, there are, of course, earlier paintings by Mondrian, and this is one of the very beautiful kind of grid pictures he painted before he became completely austere with this white ground. And that, too, I think, finds an echo. In fact, Elizabeth continues to reflect on the grid patterns that were the basis of Mondrian's work, really throughout her career thereafter. This very beautiful picture of 1982 is based on the same sort of soft grid as that, isn't it? She's aligning herself, she's learning from Mondrian, she's absorbing it, she's making it into something quite new. Even when she's visiting Japan, the grid patterns of a Japanese house with its screens echoes back to her own work, through her own work, to Mondrian. But the most surprising thing, perhaps, which he told me, was that it was seeing Mondrian's flower paintings in New York that really set her. I think it gave her a feeling that she could do it. She'd swithered in her hires when she was at school between going to botany, which was her passion, and going towards art. She went towards art, but she never lost her passion for botany. And one of her school sketchbooks, flowers, survives, and it's exquisite, as you can imagine. But she hadn't seen a way of incorporating flowers into her painting. I think, in a way, Mondrian gave her permission. And it's quite interesting, actually, that it's this one here. This is Mondrian in 1921. He went on painting flowers, but it seems that sometimes he rather changed the date. He didn't want people to know that he was still painting flowers in the 1920s, so he fudged the dates back to 1909, 1910, which makes you wonder whether he was actually putting it on a bit when he asked to move because of the trees. And deep down, he actually probably quite liked the trees as he loved the flowers. Well, that's Elizabeth on the right in 1966. And then she moves on to become the great flower painter we know. John's relationship with Rothko continues, I think. Their little Hillman minks took them around France and down to Spain. It also took them up to the northwest of Scotland and to Harris. And it was in Harris in 1974 that John painted some of his most startling original pictures, watercolors on Japanese paper. Elizabeth didn't really learn to use Japanese paper till quite a bit later, but John had got hold of some in the early 70s and actually made something really dramatic out of them. This is John on the left, Rothko on the right. He's thinking through the scale and the breadth of abstract expressionism to make something that is his own. But I think it's very striking that the Scottish artist, Sandy was talking about Gillis, the dedication that both John and Elizabeth to their art, almost monastic in a way, although they didn't live a monastic life, that sort of intensity of focus was very striking. And that was something which people like Gillis and Maxwell set the example. But they also, the older generation, they stuck to the idea that art relates to perceived experience. And so, although John said to me once that in the early 70s, the time just before he painted these pictures, the pressure on him and on his generation, he felt, to abandon any kind of figuration in their art and to detach it completely from the real world was such that he nearly gave up painting. But he found a way through, and the results are really very striking. This, you can't say this has got anything to do with Rothko, really. He's become an independent painter doing something which is dramatic and grand, but also tangibly concrete. It relates to perceived experience. And Rothko is still there in John's work, but so too is Mondrian. Broadway Boogie Woogie, surprisingly, surfaces again in these terrific pictures. When John finally gave up teaching, he had a major exhibition at the Scottish Gallery where he showed these pictures he'd painted of the Grand Canal in Venice. They are totally original, very grand, and I think amongst the finest things he painted. There's Monet there, certainly, but there's certainly also Mondrian. But what I think is so important is they are an independent statement. He's learned from all these great people, but he's done something himself, which is great. And John and Elizabeth both, I think, we must not see them as just Scottish artists. They're artists who have a claim to their place in the pantheon of international artists of their time. Thank you.
Hello. I'm going to give an anecdotal overview of the Blackadder Houston bequest, as I have experienced it in the short time that I've been in post. Discoveries made during the planning of the current exhibition and the range of items within the bequest. I took up the post of Acquisitions Coordinator in March of this year, and my main focus has been this bequest. I've been working in curatorial roles in museums and galleries for over 30 years, looking after a wide range of collections, but always involved with exhibiting and caring for fine and decorative arts. I have worked with artists in the Midlands, Cornwall and Wales. This is my first foray into Scotland. and I'm enjoying learning about Scottish art and meeting the academicians and having the opportunity to develop deeper knowledge about artists within the RSA collection, starting with Elizabeth and John. On Elizabeth's death in 2021, the RSA was left the entire contents of her large house and all of her and her husband's work held in storage via the Blackadder Houston Charitable Trust. In accepting this major gift, the Academy was fortunate enough to be given access to the artist's amazing home at Fountain Hall Road in Edinburgh from 2019. You can see on this floor plan the layout of the house. The garden store, which is just at the top here, was fitted out to store all of their finished work and had been catalogued by Annabel Macmillan in 2016. The rooms in the house are spacious, and the sitting room was hung with two of Elizabeth's large Japanese works. The dining room at the back had plan chests full of artworks and their main library, and the beautiful staircase had mixtures of works by many different artists that they'd collected over the years, including a collection of Japanese prints you can just see at the bottom. Crucially, their studios, which were all the 4 bedrooms on the first floor, of which this is the largest, were left untouched since the artist last worked in them, and could be fully photographed and documented. The painting on the easel on the right you can see in the exhibition and is believed to be the last painting Elizabeth worked on. The huge reward of a studio bequest is the breadth and depth of material contained within it. The Blackadder Houston bequest contains paintings, drawings and prints from all periods of their careers, as well as sketchbooks and studio equipment. It also features Elizabeth and John's extensive photographic and documentary archive, plus their impressive library and a feast of implements and materials. Funding for the bequest also enables the ongoing care, research and scholarship over the coming years of this significant collection. As part of the requirements of Elizabeth's will, a study collection is being created to give an insight into the working lives of both artists through their artworks, archives and inspirational materials, creating a unique and important resource in Scottish art for current and future generations. When the Academy began the process of documenting the house, 2 Academy research assistants assessed, catalogued, cleaned and packed up the studios over a period of nearly 3 years when COVID permitted. They were limited in how much detail they could go into before the house had to be cleared, and focused on photographing and safely packing as many items as possible for us to return to later and to document fully. As we now work our way through dozens of sketchbooks and thousands of drawings and works on paper, we aren't only cataloguing each image, we are looking for insights into how they approach their art in a practical way and clues to some of their thought processes that lead to the finished composition, and learning about their different styles and periods of their work. In some cases, a connection can be made straight away to completed work, such as this drawing in one of the sketchbooks, and then this finished print series by John. Others can create an interesting speculation. Does this drawing from another sketchbook ultimately lead to this print? The sketchbook that this comes from contains predominantly pastoral impressions of seascapes and landscapes. But the interesting thing about looking at other people's sketchbooks is you never know what's over the page. This example begins with a pastel study, and there are notes about colours on the inside cover. Wrong one. You just see in here, it says pale green shading up to pale blue, and other notes about possible colourings. It's followed by 2 double-page pencil sketches even, of Italy, Venice and San Lazzaro. These are followed by further pastel studies of which these are just a selection. Then, about a third of the way through, is a single study of Elizabeth with a cat. The rest of the sketchbook continues with the seascapes, and then suddenly, on the last page, is a lovely sketch of Toby. The cats seem to intersperse amongst John's sketches, although as far as I know, he never did a finished print or painting of them except as companions to Elizabeth. These sketchbooks, along with 3 of Elizabeth's, are displayed in the exhibition and can be viewed on the RSA bookshelf on the website. I'll put the address up at the end. Those of you who have been to the section of the exhibition in the President's Room will have seen the selection of items from Elizabeth's vast and eclectic collection in the Wunderkammer. One of the paintings on display is in fact entitled My Collection. This collection was spread all over the house. The studios as well, and contains hundreds of souvenirs and gifts that she collected over the years. Here is just a taste of some of the collection from when we were planning the Wunderkammer display. We are still in the process of identifying the many items which appear in her paintings, and have put some of the more interesting items on display. For example, the hats from the Still Life with Peruvian hat and the red hat. You can see the Peruvian hat's actually upside down in this painting. Also, this fan, which is seen in several paintings, including Still Life with the Leaping Cat. A particular challenge I chose to undertake was to identify as many things as possible in Still Life Kurashiki. I found 16 items so far, which are shown in the left-hand cabinet of the Wunderkammer. You can see the most obvious item is this purse, which is here. You've also got this scoop, which is here. These fans, which are here. This woven tray, which is up there. Box up here. This big ladle is here. And so on. As you can see, all the items are painted with great accuracy in this particular work, and there's no doubt when you're looking that you've found the correct item when you compare it with the painting. For example, the ladles, this big ladle as I pointed out, and this one here, and then these spoons, this one with the writing down here, and this one is just here. And then this rather strange implement, which I didn't actually believe was a correct painting until I found the implement. I have no idea what it is. I have no idea why you would have something that shape, and I thought it was a mistake until I saw the actual object. Sometimes things aren't quite what they appear. The fans turned out to be 2 boxes. I was interested to note that some of the items are painted twice from different angles, such as that big ladle is also here on its side, and this scoop is painted twice, and this spoon is painted with its back to us, and the box is painted at 2 different angles. The accuracy in her renderings doesn't mean that she doesn't employ some artistic interpretation with the objects. For example, this box actually, as you can see, has writing on the side, but she's chosen to omit it in the actual work. This is also true of the study that we found in the collection of a Turkish delight tin, which, there's no doubt it's that tin, but if you look at the writing, she's omitted the writing on the front and on the lid. Going back to her own painting of the collection, it's interesting to observe that this has been much more loosely painted, and it gives an opportunity to reflect on her different approaches to her subject matter, and is something I hope to understand more fully as my work progresses. Sometimes I've been surprised when I recognise something I wasn't expecting. I was looking at this table on this untitled still life, looking at the objects, and you will see the two little balls in the picture in the Wunderkammer. And I realised that the background wasn't just black, it's got triangles in it. And this is the front of one of their small plan chests, which was in the back study. Our focus at the moment is making these associations with paintings and drawings in order to understand the significance of the wide range of material within the bequest. As the focus widens, we'll be able to bring the archive materials, which contain a wealth of background information held in files of correspondence, boxes of invitations, catalogues and newspaper cuttings, and even holiday slides. There are documents and preparatory works relating to Elizabeth's Royal Academy of Arts commissions, and there's more personal collections, such as John's jazz records. I hope you found this brief insight into the bequest interesting. Although I wasn't involved in the documentation of the house itself, I feel honoured and privileged to be working with a bequest that has such breadth and depth. As with any artist's bequest, this is very personal and perhaps made more poignant even by the situation with Elizabeth's health at the time the Academy began working. As we work through this amazing resource of information and images, we will be ever mindful of how to best represent Elizabeth and John for future research. We will also be thinking of other collections that could benefit from material, as well as planning future exhibitions and publications to celebrate these prolific artists and their legacies. Thank you.
I think that's working, is it? Yeah, good. Have we got someone's hand up already? Oh, let's go. Can we get a mic over there, please?
Can you hear me? You'll probably excuse my ignorance on some of the subjects, but I'm fascinated to know that when you attribute a painting that is influenced by another artist, let's say Houston and Rothko, is that your personal opinion, or is there documentation and evidence to back that up?
I think the documentation's in the images, and knowing the artists, their interests. I think that if you look at their work as it evolves, you can see, I mean, it's how art works. Exchanges, kind of ongoing conversation with the past and with the present. And I think that it's quite clear, and having talked to them about it, the impact that American painting made on them was something which they weren't going to sort of say no, deny it. They admired these artists, and they learned from them. I mean, art, it piles up, doesn't it? The generations go on, and all that has gone before is there. Each generation only makes a sort of small addition because what they make incorporates so much of what has gone before. And I think John and Elizabeth would have been very happy to talk to you about Rothko. And Elizabeth, John talked about Rothko, Elizabeth talked about Mondrian. She was quite explicit about it. She said, seeing Mondrian's flower paintings made it possible for me to become a flower painter. It just sort of gave her permission in a way, because there was Mondrian, this great figure in the past. Even though he was a bit cagey about it, the art was out there, and she could admire it and learn from it. But more importantly, perhaps just take encouragement from it. I mean, she might have been inclined to simplify her canvases, but the example of Rothko, whose canvases are so dramatically simplified, gave her that encouragement. It's a wonderful, complex, symbiotic process.
There's another hand up over here.
Hi, Sandy and George. You talked in quite detail about the importance of the relationship between the art student and the tutor. I was wondering, how important was it that they had each other?
Which one wants to answer that one?
Well, obviously extremely important. I mean, it's a partnership, isn't it? Two painters living together, married, they're not going to ignore each other's work. They're going to support each other. And I think we have a lot of evidence that that was the case. And I think you could see the way they developed and grew as artists, etc., all stems from, I think, that support that the two of them gave each other. I mean, I think we all have people who support us. Artist friends, for example. I used to be supported by a guy called John Melody. And I think that's, I mean, even Picasso was supported. You know, even though he was this great egotistical monster in many ways, he needed support too. And he would always look back, as Duncan was saying, he would look back to Goya, he would look back to Velázquez, and all his Spanish pals would come round and Picasso would ask them, am I on the right lines?
Just to say that I think their relationship was fascinating. They worked at, as your floor plan showed, the studios opposite end of the landing and sort of toing and froing. And I think they were there, respectively, the best critics. But there is the question of balance. And Elizabeth certainly became more successful than John. You might have thought that there would be a little bit of unease about this. But no, if you talked about it, he simply glowed with pride. He just loved the fact that she was so successful. I mean, it was a wonderful relationship that they had.
Of course, Duncan, a lot of, as we well know, a lot of male artists stopped their wives from painting. But we better not go into that tonight.
They had a very loving relationship, and it was delightful to observe them in the house, how John did defer to Elizabeth a lot. There was a very loving relationship. But together, isn't it interesting, we're talking tonight about them as a kind of partnership. They're distinctive, their work is quite distinctive, one from the other, and yet we think of them as a couple. It's a unique and wonderful thing, I think. And we're very fortunate as Scots to, and people who knew them, to have had this model. It's fantastic.
She, after John's death, actually, Elizabeth wrote to me, and she said that if John hadn't been there, I perhaps would not have broadened out. John was immensely knowledgeable about art and contemporary art, and encouraged her, and I think fed her with his own experience, and that's what she acknowledged. She said, you know, John, it was a wonderful mutual relationship, and she saw it as that way, in that she needed John to do what she did.
Yes, we'll take your question. Get the mic up there.
Hi everyone. I had a question about the bequest, the practicalities of it. So when she left it, was the idea to recreate the studios, or are you putting a filter on the things you're taking, as in you can't take everything, there's no space in the collection? Or are you know, how are you kind of approaching that? What's the practical side of taking that collection in?
I think I'll answer some of this to start with, because that conversation started way back before John passed away. And John was really interested in how we could look after, or what the burden of that gift may be. And in 2007, at that time, we had taken on the bequest from William Littlejohn. And so the task, way back in the 1970s, in 1973, Gillis had died, and we took the entire estate. And we've kept lots of that. We've got lots of Gillises, and you can see those in the lead up to Christmas and into the new year when we celebrate Gillis. But John was very concerned that we'd be left with this legacy, that we would find it very difficult to handle. But in the intervening years, we have looked at how bequests should happen and how we can manage their legacy thereafter, keep their names going forward and support artists. And so there's a range of gifting of works, selling of some works to feed the bequest even further, and also taking in what's required to form a studio collection. And that collection is vast. As you can see in Lucinda's slides, lots of it's boxed in cylinder boxes. But that richness that you can see in the exhibition upstairs is given a unique selling point for the work, because you're experiencing part of Elizabeth and John's lives when you are so closely associated and connected to those objects, and just being able to bring that to the fore and show that these people worked and lived with these amazing things around them. Even the cats, we don't have any of the cats, by the way. But, you know, it was their entire life that we are looking after for the future. Lucinda, do you want to add anything to that? No. Silence, please, says Lucinda. Hopefully that answers your question. Yes, in the front here.
Yes, being in such a close relationship, is there any evidence that they ever collaborated on projects?
Is there any evidence that was collaboration on any of their projects?
I haven't seen it, no. I think that they watched what they were doing, and I can think if you put the work side by side, you can see that although they're very different personalities artistically, there's a lot of exchange going on. But I don't think I've ever seen anything, apart from a birthday card they sent to me, which was done by both of them.
I think it's interesting if you go way back to the first room in the galleries upstairs, which takes you back to those post-art school years when they do the Traveller. That was going to be my question. I'm going to leave that unless somebody asks it. But where you're seeing their landscapes, when they're seeing Italy for the first time. Now, I've got a memory of David Macmillan HRSA, telling me that when he and John went on the Traveller, you know, Edinburgh had been in black and white, it'd been monochrome, and they'd all learnt tonal painting in umber. And suddenly he went to Italy, and there was colour. And so I think the similarities for me is probably the Edinburgh School similarities. They're not collaborating, but they're seeing the same things at the same time and interpreting that in similar but also very different ways. So I think those early years where you can see the influence of Gillis and you can see the influence of Maxwell, and that exploration out into a new world, post-war, new world, and that a new colour for everyone. We all need a bit of that, don't we? So yeah. Any more questions? Yes, up the back.
Yeah. Just in terms of this huge range of things you've been given, are any sort of quiet thoughts about what the ultimate thing might be to collect it all together? Any quiet whisperings you've had amongst yourselves, a gallery or a big exhibition 4 or 5 years' time? Can you give us an idea of what you might bring it forward to?
Lucinda, this is just the start, isn't it? Because we still have to discover everything that we actually have. You know, we were in the house since early 2019. A little bit of that was scuppered with COVID, and there is, as you can see from the pictures of the install of the house, there are thousands of objects. So there is a study collection, a research collection that we pulled together. It will be available to research for artists and researchers, academics to research thereafter. But we have to get it into some kind of order as to know exactly what we have before we start moving that on. That might be some years down the line. But you've been thought
all the paintings and watercolours by both were catalogued before the request came to you, by my daughter Annabelle, actually.
Well done, Annabelle.
And she did a very thorough job, I think.
Do you want to add anything?
We have, at a rough estimate, the works on paper and paintings come to about 4,000. And we haven't even started on the archive. So the photographs and all the documentation and the catalogues, we haven't actually counted Elizabeth's collection yet, but I could do that. So there's a lot of supporting material which will bring a lot of new insights and additional information to the work and to how they worked, which we still need to pull together.
Yes, in the middle first, I think, Amy. Is that Ruth again?
Yes, sorry.
Ruth.
If it's rude to ask two questions, just let me know. So you said that the bequest was worth 7 million, and given that 95% of all artists in Scotland earn less than £5,000 for their practice, and that the bequest is giving an award of £20,000 for a mid-career artist, do you think there's any other organisation that's providing such an eloquent opportunity for artists within the UK?
I can't talk for other organisations, but the Academy has a long history of looking after bequests in this way. They're not just from artists, they've come from clients, from supporters. Even Andrew Carnegie gave some gold to do a Carnegie Award. So, yes, we do have quite a volume. The 7 million is the figure of funds. Of course, there's an enormous asset in the paintings and prints that we won't be holding in the studio collection and that we will move onto the market, and that the proceeds of those will join that sum which is invested, and it's the proceeds of those investments, the interest on that, which comes back down through the support networks. It's not just the £20,000 award. There are student awards, there are other mid-career awards, the support of New Contemporaries, support of a publications programme, and also the studio collection itself, research collection.
I suppose the point I was making was that £20,000 for an artist would be utterly transformative, and it will take their career to a platform that would be unattainable probably, and will project them into the future for decades to come. And that's an incredible thing, and I would like to say thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. I should also point out that there's also a McRobert Award for £20,000, which we're instigating this year as well. But what's interesting, I suppose, is that really looking at what Elizabeth wanted in her wishes, there was a gap in the market for artists in the mid-career range, because everybody wants to give money to the cult of the new and give everybody a leg up on as they leave art school. And we really felt that as artists progress, sometimes they're working really hard, they've got other opportunities or other things playing on their lives, like mortgages and childcare and all sorts. And it's just that's intended to buy them some time to be able to actually get into the studio and have practice or travel and see something new, because that's what Elizabeth and John and many artists have done throughout their careers, and that's the leg up that we felt was best for different artists at different stages in their career. At the back there, Amy, you could.
Hello, can I just ask, have you ever found any journals or diaries to actually document what they were planning on painting or how they portrayed what they did?
Lucinda, did you hear that one?
We haven't really got that far. I know some of the sketchbooks have actually got itineraries for their trips, and that will help us understand when some of the sketchbooks were completed and where they were when. So there are notes certainly in the sketchbooks, but we have 140 sketchbooks to go through. So it's early days. It'll be very interesting if there is.
Are there any other questions anyone would like to ask? Yes, over here on the edge.
Lucinda, you said you were packing things up to leave the house. Can I ask where everything is now? Is it stored together with all the rest of the RSA collections, or is it a lot of stuff?
The majority of it is with the other RSA collections, yes. There are still paintings that are stored outside the collections they're still to be transferred by the charitable trust. So they will be probably stored separately just because of the quantity of them. but we're looking at that at the moment.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from the floor? Yes, over here. Oh, there's somebody at the back, and then you'll get your... We'll bring the mic down to you.
There will be a lot of Elizabeth's paintings and John's that weren't signed. What happens to them?
Our study collection becomes bigger. That's the simple answer, isn't it? I'm nodding, asking Sandy as well in the front. Yes.
An unsigned painting can still be an authentic painting by an artist. It just requires perhaps a little bit more understanding and a bit more research sometimes.
And often these unsigned items are transitional pieces between one body of work or the working of an idea into another body of work. So they're sometimes really crucial for us to keep in order that we can see that progression, or they give us the clues to the movement from one period into another. So they're not always just unfinished and therefore maybe not important in the artist's career. They're quite often this transitional clue which suddenly you have that eureka moment.
Elizabeth and John actually do seem to be quite thorough about signing things.
Amy, this lady in the flowery top.
Yeah, you emphasised, and I think I've also read about this as well, Houston's definitely wanting to be sort of anchored in something that he observed and not to become fully abstract as a painter. And so I've wondered about that and sort of wondered why, really, and wonder if any of you have a hypothesis about that, or if you are privy to his thoughts.
Sandy, what was the question? Whether John was rooted in... Actually, do you want to just say your question again? And Sandy...
Well, my understanding is that he definitely wanted to maintain and be rooted in something he could see, something observed, and not to become fully abstract in his painting. And I wondered if you had a hypothesis about his thinking on that and why that was.
Well, I think... Is this working? I think all of the artists, all of the Scottish artists, really coming from the so-called Edinburgh School, from Gillis, Maxwell, to Houston, to Blackadder, they never gave up on what they saw in front of them. No. They never gave up on the visible, on the world, as it were, and their imaginations as well. They all, abstraction wasn't for them. Thank goodness, in a way. I mean, abstraction was certainly for the Americans. That really was a huge, adventure for American painters, post-war. But these Scottish painters like Anne Redpath, etc., they stuck to their guns. The visible world it had everything that they needed to explore. Yeah.
Can I just say, well, if you just look at the house, absolutely jam-packed with objects. They were in love, besotted by objects and exotic objects. And I said at the end of my piece that this reaching out, it's a Scottish thing, I dare say, reaching out to unknown lands with an obsession for the new, for things, for objects which ignite imaginative ideas. So I think that that's very Scottish, and you can see how they, very eloquently we saw here, how they embraced world art, but the eye came home.
There was Alan Bowness, who, a dear friend and my tutor, wrote a book about British art in the 60s, and he committed serious solecism because he said, Joan Edley, had she had the courage to become an abstract artist, could have been a great painter. But of course, it was precisely because, and this is what, you remember what I told about John's crisis in the 70s. It was by the courage not to become abstract painters, but to stick to what they believed in, that they came through. And they were actually the greater painters because they didn't follow fashion. They absorbed its lessons of the latest the latest ideas, but they didn't surrender and lose their personalities. They didn't give up on this determination that art is about experience. There has to be a connection with something seen to what is being made.
Is there anyone else who would like to say anything? Ask anything? Well, oh, there's a hand. Almost got my question in there.
Actually, it's not. Can you hear?
Yes.
Not a question, more a comment. John in particular taught me, and Elizabeth a bit, and I was influenced by both of them. But what stood out for me was, well, their generosity. I remember visiting the house, seeing their studios, showing me round the garden, which was a delight. I do more gardening than painting these days. But what really impressed me about them was not only how generous they were and how that shone through their work somehow, that sort of joy and love of painting, very inspirational, but also that they dedicated themselves as painters. And it was incredible, you know, to meet a couple who didn't argue in their separate studios. They supported one another, and it was just a complete joy to see that. So that's what I want to remember about both of them.
Thank you. I think that echoes. That will echo a lot of people's understanding and memories of Elizabeth and John as students or people or friends, colleagues, academicians who grew up and around and were in and out of John and Elizabeth's lives, and that kind of holistic family feeling really spread to quite a lot of us, and that's a lovely thing to hear. It's also a lovely way of capturing the flavour of that, to take that forward for people as a researcher. You know, that's a social history element that takes things forward for people in the future to understand that kind of warmth that they as a couple had for art and artists and culture and creativity and a world view, not just a Edinburgh view or a Scottish view, but a wonder at the world at wide.